All right. Hello and welcome to our virtual stage crew series we've been doing here. Today we have Fletcher McCune from the New School in New York City. I've known Fletcher for over 10 years now. We used to work together at New World Stages, and he's done a lot of production work in all sorts of fields, but has mainly focused on electrics here. So welcome, Fletcher, and let's start by just talking about how you got into theater.
Sure. I was actually really lucky. So when I was in elementary and middle school and everything down in Miami, I went to magnet programs, fine arts magnet programs. So I was taking drama classes and dance classes and stuff since I started school. And while I was in later elementary school, I kind of got heavily involved in a theater program, and I thought that was really fun until I discovered that I have a crippling fear of being on stage. So I was like, well, that's not going to work out. But they were like, all right, Fletcher, we'll sit you next to the light board. And I just kind of started pushing buttons on the light board. And I was like, this is kind of the coolest thing I've ever done. And it just kind of rolled from there. Like I did it all the way through high school, and was really lucky where when I went into college, I went in initially as a theater major, doing lighting design, and I've just kind of kept doing that. And I went to a place called Florida International University down in Miami, that actually has some really great facilities for at the time was a fairly small commuter college. It's grown significantly since then, but it was good equipment, and I just kind of rolled with it. I got my undergraduate degree in lighting design, and almost immediately upon finishing college, I discovered that I didn't want to actually design, so I went into electrician work and console programming. Um, but I really got into theater because I love the collaborative nature of it. Like you will never see someone do a production by themselves. It just doesn't. You can't do it. There's too much that goes into it. You know. Did you want me to kind of talk about the rest of the path from there today?
Yeah, we just talking about like sticking with you real early on. A question some people have asked is like if there's like one show that stands out in your mind that you like either worked on or like saw as a kid that like really got you kind of like got the bug in there. I think that's been a
There is, there is, and I can tell you, it's very specifically when I was very, very young, certainly elementary school, probably pre-Hurricane Andrew, so pre-1992. Uh, my uncle took me and my brother to go see a touring production of Starlight Express on Miami Beach, and if you guys aren't familiar with it, which I would be surprised if you are, because it's kind of a esoteric show. It's about trains, and everybody does the entire production on roller skates, and they roller skate around the entire theater. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, and I pretty much caught the bug off of that one.
nice. And were you seeing so like that was a bigger touring production? Um were you seeing mostly kind of like nationally touring stuff, like going to a pretty big theater, or were you like seeing a lot of like local little stuff as well?
It was probably more local. There's a not-for-profit regional theater down in South Florida called Actors Playhouse, which did a lot, which still does quite a bit of educational and children's theater. And as part of the magnet programs, they would take us at least once a year, usually to go see sometimes just a children's production, sometimes one of their main stage productions. I remember going to see Tom Sawyer, I believe, was one of the shows, right? That's the one with the Old Man River in it. I think so. But I remember definitely going to see some stuff at our local regional theater as well. Um, but Miami didn't have a very robust local theater community. So when I was young, a lot of the stuff that came through there was national touring shows.
Nice. um yeah, so you want to talk a little bit about like your college program and like what that looked like down there and um
Sure. So FIU did not have a terribly large theater department. It was probably grand total was a couple of hundred students. And all but probably a dozen of those students were performance based. or performance emphasis. So we ended up having a very tight knit group of production people we all kind of did a little bit of everything. While I was there, I got experience working as an electrician and a lighting designer because that was my primary focus. But I was also doing work study as a carpenter in their scene shop. So I built all the sets and stuff in there as well. Um, we didn't really have a very robust sound department, so I kind of taught myself a lot of sound, uh, basic sound, just enough to get sound to come out of speakers, really. I'm not going to say I'm a great sound engineer, but I can get things to turn on. We did a little bit of everything. And kind of while I was there, they hired a series of more experienced production staff and faculty. So as I was there, the quality of the productions increased quite a bit, and I did a lot of I learned a lot of rigging while I was there, working with a fly system, 10-foot arbor counterweight single purchase fly systems. Learned all Did really some cool carpentry tricks, different types of laminate processes, and I learned how to weld while I was there. So it was a really well equipped school that got a chance to give me a very broad based education, which is kind of unique in my experience. Most of the students that I work with now coming out of school tend to be more focused in one discipline or another.
Mhm.
So I feel very lucky in that because it certainly served me well over the last 20 years or so.
And so was that work, was that like all part of the education there, or was that any of that like overhire? Were you getting paid for any of that at that point?
A lot of the carpentry stuff I did was overhire because that was part of the federal work study program,
Okay.
um, but not exclusively. I have also, in most situations I've been in, I've been one of their more talented and knowledgeable technicians. So I people would ask me on a regular basis, like, "Hey, do you want to learn this new skill, and you want to be in charge of that for the show?" And every time I would jump at it and say yes, because I don't believe that there's ever anything you should not learn. You
Hmm.
know, I even did a couple of shows as a costume run crew and some time in a costume shop. Not my most successful adventures, but I did them anyway, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and because we were such a small production department, there was a huge amount of opportunity.
Nice. Cool. You want to just kind of talk a little bit about your career path?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was finishing up my undergrad in my design degree, I designed a few shows outside of the school, but I realized fairly quickly that I did not want to be responsible for the aesthetic of the show. I was much more interested in being responsible for the function of the equipment that was there, which was great because while I was in school, I freelanced around South Florida as a freelance stagehand. So I would work doing load in and load outs of arena touring shows. So like the first arena tour I ever did was a Britney Spears tour when she was just coming on to the national touring circuit. So I did a whole lot of like as part of local crews. I wasn't in charge of anything. I was just a set of hands to push stuff. But I learned a lot about how large equipment is set up and the process about how do you get all of this equipment into an arena in 8 hours, do a show, and then take it down in 4 hours. Um, I also freelanced at that same theater I mentioned, Actors Playhouse, as an overhire electrician there for many, many years. They would set up a show and I would come in for a week to hang their lights, focus their lights, and then I would move on to the next production. So I did that for a brief period of time after college. But as luck would have it, right at the time I was finishing college, there's a very large $500 million performing arts center that was opening up right as I finished college. And one of the shows that I was freelancing on, they called it the City Theater Summer Shorts, which is a festival of one act plays. The lighting designer for that show was telling me that they had a small black box, well, small, as a 400 seat black box space that they were looking for someone who was relatively young in the industry and had some design background. So on a whim, one night I filled out the resume, dropped in an application, really with no expectation of anything coming from it. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, I got a call from the director of production asking me to come in for an interview. So I came in, I did my interview. It turned out me and him because of all the freelancing work that I had done over the last 4 years, knew a lot of the same people. What the company that I did that installed fly systems and rigging, the owner of that company and the director of production were actually good friends, so we chatted about him for a while. And walking out of it, I had a really good feeling about it. And about 2 days later, I was offered the job. Um, I was offered the job as the head electrician for the Carnival Studio Theater at the Adrian Arsht Center for the Performing Arts of Miami-Dade County. Longest job title I've ever had in my life. But they hired me on into and it was great because it was a union contract right out of college.
Oh, wow.
And because in that particular venue there is just a head electrician and a head of audio, I ended up being the work steward for that venue as well. So I ran a union crew right out of college, which was another interesting learning experience, having a 23-year-old kid running crews of gentlemen and men and women who had been doing this for 20 years by that point.
Some of them a little surly, I bet, too.
Surly and salty would be a good way to describe some of them. In fact, he wasn't my boss. He was the head. He was the head carpenter of the largest venue, which was a 2,400 seat Broadway house where all the large yellow card tours would go through. That gentleman, his name was Danny Mack. Danny McMiniman is actually his name, but I already called him Danny Mack. Danny Mack had opened every major performing arts center in South Florida. He had toured as the head carpenter for Miss Saigon and Jesus Christ Superstar and several other touring productions that I have since forgotten. But the man is a legend in the South Florida theater community, and he taught me a lot of things about about being a stagehand in a union setting. Um, got a couple of good tongue lashings from him too over the years.
Yeah, I bet.
Uh, so I was there for probably 3 years while my girlfriend, now wife, was finishing her master's degree. Um, and when she finished, she was applying for jobs all around the country. And she, as luck would have it, got a job working for a university here in New York City as a residence hall director. And as part of her salary package was an apartment. So when somebody says, "Hey, you want to move to New York City and we'll give you an apartment as part of a salary package," I mean, how do you say no to that? The only unfortunate part of it was that was 2009, so it was kind of right at the height of the financial recession. So we packed up our house, we moved up to New York City, me without a job, no real contacts in New York City, and figured out how to make money, you know. And that was a challenge because it was a place where it was at a time when there wasn't a lot of theater being produced because there was not a lot of liquid assets around because it was a hard time for everyone. And the calls that were available, particularly in the union side of it, because New York stagehands function very differently than South Florida. It was really hard to get work because people would show up to the calls and there was not a lot of extra positions opened up, and I didn't have a big network of colleagues at the time. So it took me about 2 years of a lot of unemployment, you know, working a lot of kind of really awful off Broadway and off Broadway jobs and installations. And at one point, I worked as a shop manager, and I say that with air quotes because really I was a glorified truck driver. And I drove a truck around Manhattan for about 6 months, which was not, I would say, was not a terribly fun job because I'm not a great truck driver to begin with, and driving around Manhattan in a 24-foot box truck is a challenge.
I only
uh,
had the pleasure of doing that a handful of times, but one of the times I was like in the middle of one of the ticket blitzes, and I got like most of the way through the intersection, and like the end of the truck was still in the crosswalk, and they just had like cops stationed at every corner, like walking out and just handing you a ticket. It was awesome.
yep, I feel bad for some of the people in New York City because they may have lost three rear mirrors once or twice. Sorry, guys. Um, but so that was interesting, but after doing that, I got involved with New World Stages. Initially, just kind of as an overhire, you know, as a way to make some kind of money. I ended up as what they call an operations assistant, which is really a more facilities oriented job, making sure that, you know, toilets are get unclogged and door locks work, and if they need to change the temperature or changing the HVAC settings. So I started doing that, which eventually led to some really nice and steady stagehand work. Eventually picking up the head props track on a off-Broadway production of Rent that I was on that production for 9 or 10 months as a department head. And again, as strangely enough, the rest of the production crew, it being an off Broadway show, the production crew tended to be, or the run crew, I should say, tended to be on the young side. So I was one of the older run crew. So I ended up being the head of the run crew as well. So I dealt with doing payroll, and if there was any uh, problems that needed to be solved, that I was there with that. I helped solve problems and facilitate communications. When something broke on some of the equipment, I helped facilitate repairs from the shops. So I was there, like I said, for about a year, and then again, a little serendipitously, right when that show closed, a full-time position opened up at New World Stages that was the technical manager position. So I interviewed for that position, was able to pick up that job. Again, they had known me because I worked in that building for a while. So to me, it felt like it was a pretty quick, streamlined process. And then I landed that job, and I was in that position for about 5 years. And that one was also really interesting because there was the company in general changed quite dramatically from the time I started to the time I ended. Even the ownership of the company, who owned us, changed hands. At the end, we ended up being owned by a company called the Schubert Organization, and the Schubert Organization owns 17 of the Broadway houses. So part of what happened, what I was doing a lot of near the end of my time there, was integrating the New World Stages processes and how we went about our business, integrating that into a large corporate Broadway organization, which had very different ways of doing things, and it's like how we all work together as one company. So I was there, and right before I left, I ended up getting a call from one of my friends, who at the time was the vice dean of production at the new school. They had just opened up a full-time master electrician position, and she initially reached out to me to see if there was anybody I knew who would be interested. And again, kind of on a whim, I was like, "Yeah, I'll put it in an application, see what comes from it." It never really hurts to put in an application, see what comes from it. I was brought in for an interview, was offered the job. Initially said no because the money wasn't right for me. They came back with a larger offer, and I kind of couldn't pass up working for an educational institution because I was looking for some job security, and I moved over to where I am now at the new school, where I've been for 3 years, I guess. And it was good. Well, and then COVID kind of made things a little bit strange, but it was a nice, solid job. I I really, really liked the change of why I did theater. When I was at New World Stages, we were doing theater to make money, trying to get people in the seats and make money off the tickets. And moving into an educational institution, we were doing theater to give students experience on stage. So that kind of shift in why we were doing it really it alleviated a lot of stress from myself, and let me be in a position to do something that I really love, because I love teaching people how to be stagehands. It's kind of a brief rundown of what I've done for the last 20 years.
Nice. So there's a couple things I'd like to talk about in there, like the New World experience. Obviously I was there for a big chunk of it, so that is an interesting setup where it's like, for people that don't know, it's a 5-theater off-Broadway venue. It used to be a movie theater that was then converted into playhouses. So we'd have 5 theatrical, maybe 6 or 7 theatrical shows going on at a time, with some long-term rentals. As it was a corporate entity and making money off of ticket sales was like the main goal, we would sometimes have a space share, which is never a really great idea, to have like somebody doing a show on top of the gazillion bubble show. but it was done many, many times. And then we'd also did a ton of events. And I think that's where you really came into the picture originally, probably was like working a lot of those one-off events that we do during the day. So I guess if you could maybe talk about like the difference, we've had one person kind of talk about doing like corporate events from like an AV standpoint. Um, just kind of talk a little bit about like the events world versus that facilities world versus that theatrical world that
Mhm.
I know that job really um, played around a lot with, and like how those skills have overlapped or diversed or diverged, I guess is the word I was looking for.
Sure. At the core for a lot of those, especially so a lot of what I did at New World Stages wasn't necessarily what you would consider traditional stagehand work of hanging lights and building sets. That's not necessarily what I did at that job. A lot of that position for me was more logistics. So each show, each event, like they would have their production manager who ran that show. But a lot of my job was coordinating between that person about how you get equipment into the building, because the entire complex was 2 stories underground. So getting equipment into the building was actually really hard to do sometimes. Getting trucks down into the loading dock. So a lot of my job was the logistics of physically how do you get stuff in and how do you do it without disturbing everybody else around you. Um, and that kind of came in really handy when it came to events, because corporate events are really short term. They come in, they set up some kind of stage. They a lot of it is what we call talking heads, which is like it's not like there's bands and there's not like there's scenes with blocking. It's you set up some chairs on stage, some kind of aesthetic in the background. Maybe you set up a large projection screen behind the chairs. They bring in some keynote speakers. Everybody sits down for a few hours and has a fireside chat about the Adobe introducing a new Adobe suite, or when one of the things that I always remember was they called it the Landlords series, which was a meeting, a quarterly meeting of a whole bunch of people who own property in New York City would come together, and when they would talk about the challenges of owning property and renting property in New York City. So they would come in for an hour, they would have a fireside chat, they would talk about that. They would run through maybe a slideshow presentation or a PowerPoint presentation. Um, Sometimes they would do simulcasting where they would have people from Israel be on a webcam, and they would be had to be projected onto the screen but still be able to interact with the moderators. So it wasn't like a traditional theater setting where you're telling a story, but it was a lot of people talking about, how do they make their businesses better from separate locations, or sometimes they would be, multiple presentations on stage. Sometimes there would be some really intense video work that would go into that. Again, I didn't necessarily execute those videos, but I was the person that coordinated a lot of it. So I worked with the rental companies, the companies that we would rent equipment from, to get the correct packages, get the right kind of projectors, get the right kind of cables, get the right kind of switcher scalers. Sometimes hire staff who was able to run that equipment. Um, because a lot, like I would say corporate events is more about the projections and the video images. Plays a much larger role in corporate events than it does in the theater world. The theater world, the scenic elements and the lighting elements were much more complicated. Um, but again, a lot of what I had experienced doing before that was working in multi-venue performing arts centers. So I was really comfortable coordinating between multiple departments of multiple people so that everybody got on the same page, all the equipment got in, got set up correctly. It worked. When there was a problem, who do you talk to solve that problem? And it was really important in New World because for several of the theaters, to get the equipment into the building, you had to go through other theaters. And really like multi-venue performing arts centers is, especially in New York City, really a rare thing. There's not very many of them. You get outside of New York City and they become much more common. But in New York, it's not something that happens. It's like one theater, one building. So that idea of coordinating amongst a whole bunch of people is foreign to most people I work with currently. So it kind of, because I'd done it before, I kind of had a leg up on that.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Well, you want to walk us through what you're doing at the new school now and like what the program looks like there? And
So are we talking what it would normally be, or are we talking
let's start
pandemic
with
era?
normal. Let's start with normal, and we'll talk about how things have changed at the end there.
Sure. So my official title is the Master Electrician for the College of Performing Arts. So I don't work with just the drama school. I work with the New School for Drama, the Mannes School of Music, which is a pretty traditional music conservatory. It's been around for over 100 years. They have a very well known and highly thought of opera program for um, vocalists. They have a very robust classical music program for learning how to play instruments. For compose, they have a very strong composing program. Conductors, they've produced some really high quality conductors and maestros have come out of that program. So that program is focused really on classical music. 90 one of the major groups is, they call it the Mannes Orchestra, which is anywhere from a 64 to a 90-piece orchestra, um, dealing with undergraduate and graduate level students. And I will say this, I have worked with some truly amazing orchestras over the years: the Boston Philharmonic, the New World Symphony in Miami, the Cleveland Orchestra, and this group, this Mannes Orchestra, can compete with any of them. Just some really gifted musicians come out of there. And in addition to the School of Drama and Mannes, there's also the School of Jazz and Contemporary Music, which is just like it sounds like, it's a jazz program. And they have an association with the Grammy Museum, where a lot of jazz composers and jazz vocalists and musicians have won Grammy awards that have come out of this program, won Grammy awards, and a lot of them have come back and are adjunct professors or guest professors. Um, so each one of those three schools, I kind of did something unique for each one of those three. The drama program, uh, because the new school only has acting, directing, and playwriting tracks. They don't have design programs or technical theater programs. Um, it functions like a mid-sized off-Broadway theater. So I hire freelance electricians. So I hire all the hiring. I hire them to come in and set up the lights, make any changes, do our focus. I hire a programmer who comes in and programs the lights for that lighting designer. Um, so I'm really involved into like the real day-to-day operations of that particular theater. And drama does anywhere from usually about 4 to 5 main stage productions per semester.
And that's
Uh,
all undergrad, right?
Mixture of undergrad and graduate. So
Okay.
it's usually at least 2 undergraduate productions and at least 2, sometimes 3 graduate level productions. Usually the fall semester is all um, previously written works: Tennessee Williams, Shakespeare, Greek tragedy, and then in the spring is really where the graduate and the undergraduate playwriting students. Ooh, my camera freaked out a little bit. Um, Come on, sorry guys. There we go. So the spring is really where we get our playwriting students involved. So a lot of the shows that happen in the spring semester tend to be original and new work productions, and working on an original piece that's never been performed anywhere has its own set of challenges to it. And since we are teaching undergraduate directors, or excuse me, graduate level direct, I work mostly with the graduate students. I would say about 60 to 70% of my work in drama is with graduate students. So it's teaching graduate directors how to have a conversation with their design team. So it's not at least necessarily teaching them how to be a lighting designer. It's about how do you have an intelligent and functional conversation with your lighting designer. And then their final thesis in their third year is executing a fully realized play with a professional design team, a full production department support, um, props department, costume department, scenic departments, all those kind of stuff. It'll be interesting to see where it goes this year, because they just this year are basically introducing a new MFA program, new class structure, new academic structure. The pedagogical approach to it is going to be different. And since it's kind of happening in the pandemic, there's a little bit of yet to be determined what it's going to be. But the concept is still the same. We're taking graduate students and teaching them how to be actors who can work across, who can be actors who work across the board, playwrights who can have a conversation with the design team on original work. My support in Manus actually has a lot. They do every year. The School of Manus does one fully realized opera production that we don't do in our campus. We rent out a Union Theater here in New York City, and we do it in that venue. So my work for the operas is not hanging the show and doing all that. That is actually left up to the house electrician. A lot of what I do is the advanced work and the production electrician work. So I get the light plots, I look at the inventory that the venue has, and then I produce a rental package. I work with the different shops to do different rental quotes to get, the equipment we need for the price that we need. It's in our budget. Make sure it gets delivered appropriately. I work with the house electrician in John Jay College to make sure it gets hung. If there's any questions or adaptations that need to be made, I either make the executive decision or I am the go-between between the house electrician and the lighting design staff. The operas tend to be larger shows. They have, their budgets for the opera shows are probably 4 to 5 times what the drama shows are on a per show basis. And the lighting designers tend to be lighting designers who work in larger scale venues as well. So there's a little bit more give and take and negotiation involved in there. And School of Jazz is actually really funny. I don't do a huge amount with the School of Jazz because School of Jazz does small ensemble work is mostly what they do. So I set up some presets in their venues so that the students or the performance can come in, push 1 or 2 buttons, a look comes up on stage that's kind of visually interesting. They do the performance and then they turn it off and go home. So that's and then I also, in addition to that, I consult around the university in spaces that I don't directly manage about capital improvement. I would say capital improvement is something that takes up a large amount of my time. For example, the landmark space that I don't necessarily manage, but I'm a more experienced electrician, particularly when it comes to lighting consoles and lighting control, than who they have on staff. I was brought in to help consult on what should the new console be. They wanted to buy a bunch of moving head units, intelligent lighting. What kind of intelligent lighting should we bring in? What's the infrastructure that we need to be able to do that? Because hanging positions are awful there. So we brought in a full stage truss with chain motors and power distribution for chain motors, signal distribution so that the truss can be lowered in for maintenance. So I consult on a lot of that across the university as well.
Nice. So it sounds like you're kind of doing a lot of production management mixed in with this electrician role as well. Like who are you working with? Like who are the other staff? Do you have like a production management team there that you're?
There is. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, we did have 5 production managers that would all work on various projects across the university, because across the entire College of Performing Arts, we probably do 400 to 500 individual events per semester. Now, some of those are very small concerts where they don't require a lot of support, but the production managers work on a series of these productions, and the production managers focus just on that production, where I do more of I just look at the lighting department for each production. So I work with all 5 production managers just on the lighting departments, working with the challenge. If we're going into a space that we're renting out, I go in and do site surveys and I tell them what they need, and we deal with power distribution and data distribution. Or when I deal with the drama shows, I am the head of the lighting department, so I work with the lighting designer. I sit in production meetings. I sit in design meetings. I work on a little bit on strategic planning for the upcoming semesters about where do we allocate funds for in our budget lines. This show is going to be a particularly more complex lighting show, so we need to allocate more money there. But so there's a whole production management team that oversees the individual productions. I just look at purely the lighting department and power distribution. We did also have a head of audio and video who ran the audio and the video side of it. That person and I worked very closely together because of power distribution, signal distribution. MIDI distribution. A lot of these shows are MIDI and MIDI and SMPTE or OSC communication, so I deal with that. There's also there was a full costume department that I would work with the costume department if they had a show where they needed to like put lights into a costume. I would work with them on wiring and battery support for it, or wireless DMX if it was called for. There was a full props department that I worked with the props department to build the onstage practicals or uh, specific props that needed lighting or electrical support inside of it. Then there's a scenic department that I worked very closely with. Also, because of my rigging background, me and the carpenters do work together a lot on the rigging that needs to be installed. And because the lighting, our light plot in that theater is what's called a repertory light plot, which means we put up a light plot and we don't really change it, we just refocus. If you put a piece of scenery up, sometimes it's directly in front of a lighting unit. So we have to work with them very closely on where things do and don't need to move. And then in one of our other buildings where my office is not, we have a position that's called the Director of Event Technology. And that person manages all the entertainment technology in that building, but we don't expect that person to be an expert in it. So if a lighting system goes down and he can't immediately fix it, he picks up the phone and calls me and it's like, hey, there's a problem, you need to come over and look at the lighting system in this venue. But I don't necessarily do day-to-day operations of that building.
Okay. Wow. It's big.
So yeah,
Big
the College of Performing Arts is only about 5 years old. So it's very much, we're kind of creating processes as we go.
Mhm.
It's part of the reason why I took the job, because it was going to be a challenge creating an entirely new system of how do they work.
Nice. And how long have you been there now? Is that...
About 3 years.
Oh, wow. So it was very new when you came
Oh
in.
yeah, nobody has had this job before me. They created the position and I was hired into it.
Nice.
Before I was there, they used freelancers on a gig basis, so there was nobody overseeing everything, and it was problematic.
Yeah, for sure. The one thing you mentioned the union a little bit, but that's something we haven't really talked very specifically about, and I wonder if you could just like speak a little bit about like joining the union, being a union stagehand, like what that entails and the advantages or potential disadvantages and how that's like worked for you moving around.
Yeah, and union. So my experience. So I am a member of IATSE Local 500 in South Florida. So I got my journeyman card when I was in South Florida as a department head in a union venue. So the way that Local 500 had it set up at the time, and I believe it is still the case, is if you work in what they call a shop position, which is technically what that was. It's shop position loosely translates into full-time position under a collective bargaining agreement. If you hear me say CBA, I'm referring to a collective bargaining agreement, which is the contract that you work under. If the way that South Florida did it is if you work under a CBA in 1 year, you do, I think it was 600 hours or something like that, you can apply for membership, which I did. So I worked my 600 hours. I put in my application to the international and the local. It goes up for a vote before the international or local. Do they want to accept you in? Yes or no? And then you're inducted into it. And at the time, South Florida works differently than New York, where South Florida, the union has a hiring hall. So in South Florida, when there's a show or somebody comes in, they call up the hiring hall and they say, hi, we're doing a show in the studio theater at the Arch, and we need 15 or 20 stagehand across these different departments. Union finds those people and just sends them out, right? That's kind of what a hiring hall is. Some places have hiring halls. New York City, for example, does not the union local one here is not a hiring hall. So all of the union, all of the different production electricians for the individual theaters or the individual productions hire freelance electricians. So you have to, in New York City, you have to build your own network of electricians that you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got a load in this day. Can you work it? And you have to find 5, 6, 20 stagehands or electricians to work that call. You also have to worry about, if somebody calls out, getting that person replaced, which in South Florida, you don't necessarily have to worry about. In South Florida, if somebody doesn't show up for the call, you pick up the phone, you call the hiring hall, you say, hey, this person didn't show up, send a replacement. So they're kind of different methods to get you to the same point. But New York is such a freelance style city. Um, a lot of it is left up to the individual electricians, where because Local 500 doesn't just handle Miami, Local 500 handles West Palm Beach, Broward County, which is Fort Lauderdale area, and Miami, technically Monroe, the Florida Keys too. It's just a large geographic area, so they're much more controlled over who they send there. Like I would oftentimes not work anywhere other than Miami-Dade County because I was on the Miami call list. So that's kind of how they separated out. The benefits of working on a union contract, well, you know what your rate is going to be, and that rate is negotiated for you. Um, so instead of you as an individual working with the company and you don't have a lot of power as one person, the union negotiates the contract for you, and they establish what your work rules are going to be, how many hours you can work without a meal break. If you work beyond that, what the penalty is. They work what your hourly rate is going to be, what your overtime rate is going to be. They work out what your performance rate is going to be. If the performance is recorded and going to be broadcast nationally, like when I did the work on the Super Bowl and I was show called for the Super Bowl a couple of years, I knew that I was making X amount of money for the show, and it was multiplied by 7 times because it was a nationally televised broadcast. So that kind of is worked out by the union on your behalf. To do that, they take money out of your paycheck for health insurance, for your annuity, which is your retirement fund, for stamps and union dues, which is how they do the administrative work and pay their office staff for you. That's taken out of your paycheck and allocated there. So your paychecks are a little bit lower than just taxes. Like state of Florida does not have city and state income tax; they just have federal income tax. But when you work under a CBA, you take out some extra money that you don't take out of as a individual freelancer. But you don't have as much power as an individual to change if you don't like your work rules, or you don't often get a chance to say, hey, if I work more than 4 hours, I get a meal penalty. As an individual, you don't really have the power to do that. You're often told, okay, if you want to do that, we won't hire you. We'll hire somebody else who does not have that. So there's pros and cons to it, and the skill level depends on who you talk to. But in my experience, the skill level of your stagehands, they tend to be more skilled in a union setting, just primarily because the people who are in that union setting have had to work for a number of years to get into the union, so they just have more experience than folks who don't. I'm not going to say that's a rule for everybody, because just like any situation, there are exceptions to the rules. But knowing what your work rules are, knowing what your rates are, and if there are problems, you know who you can go talk to about it. It's kind of a benefit.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And you're still an active member of 500, so you're like paying union dues in Florida, even though you're working in New York City?
I do. I am. I keep what they call stamps. So I don't work in that jurisdiction, so I don't pay, like my current paycheck, I don't take any money out of my paycheck to pay into them, because that's not Local 500's jurisdiction. Now, if I ever move back to Miami and I picked up work, I would have to pick up work through the hiring hall, because I am a journeyman member.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have to either pick up work through the hiring hall or get permission to work outside of it. And then they would be taking money out of my paycheck. But I do pay for what's called stamps, which is just administrative fees for the international, which has cost me about $300 a year to keep my membership active. So I still keep my membership active. I still vote in the officer elections. They still call me occasionally. Like when the Super Bowl was in Miami this past year, I got a couple of calls from them saying, hey, are you interested in flying back to work for a couple of weeks? Because when the Super Bowl is in town, every stagehand for 500 miles around it will pick up work.
Right. And does that still allows you to do union work in New York City? You just don't have any like preferential treatment, right?
Technically, yes, because Local 500's jurisdiction only applies to Miami-Dade, West Palm Beach, and Broward County. Any work that's done outside of that is done outside of their jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I did a lot of work in union venues, in different union venues around the country, it's oftentimes what is recommended is that you would get what's called a touring card or a road card.
Hmm.
which is you pay a little bit extra money, and they give you basically it's an extra fee that says, yes, I'm a local 500 member, but I'm not working in those venues. I'm working in other union venues around the country. Uh, and it kind of, again, it pays administrative fees, and there's some politics at play there.
Hmm.
But in New York City, I don't really work in union venues in New York City because I have a full-time job with the school, and that is not under a CBA. There's really no conflict of interest there.
Nice.
And the few times when I do go into a union venue, I'm not actually allowed to do anything except answer questions.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure how that played out. That was something I'm not in the union. I've always just thought I would uh, join eventually, but I never lined up on my career path. So
Yeah,
I think it's an
if you
interesting.
are not covered under the collective bargaining agreement for that theater, the general rule is that you're not allowed to actually do any stagehand work. Which for me as a production electrician means that I sit at a table in front of a computer and wait for them to ask me questions.
Nice. Um, so you want to talk about like what advice you'd have for people that want to follow like a similar foot path or a career path? Things that you definitely say like you've got to do this and maybe skip over, step D or something.
Sure. The first thing I'll mention is college because there's really if you're wanting to go out and you're wanting to be really just a stagehand, working as an electrician, working as a carpenter, it does not require a college degree. And if anybody says that you have to have a college degree to have one of those jobs, they're they're looking for someone specific. But you don't need it. It really is a tradesman's job. It's a union contract. It's a real blue collar type of situation. So there is a world where you can not go to college and just right at a school start working for the union, start working at your local theaters, and just learn your trade with your by your hands. I will say if you are really interested in designing, being a lighting designer, uh, a traditional academic setting is probably something that you would want to explore, because a lot of people who hire designers do like to see at least an undergraduate degree in lighting design. And if you're going to be working in the educational settings, and if you're a lighting designer at some point, you probably will be working in an educational setting. They do like to see master's degrees as well. Um, I'm not going to say it's strictly required, but the design track your college experience is something you should really think about. But if you're just going to be an electrician, you can think about just working your way up through the tracks through the unions. Like a lot of local unions have apprentice programs. Um, you can do you can work under a CBA for X number of hours, and you can get more work that way. So it kind of is like which way you want to go. You should think about. But for both of them, what I really will say is that the most important part is going to be your work ethic, because I say it as a joke, but it's not really that much of a joke. Doing theater is a terrible way to make a living, um, because it can be very very hard work for very very long hours, and when you're first starting out, the pay is not great. So you really have to be passionate about what you do. I've heard it said before, if you can see yourself doing anything other than theater, you should probably do that. I don't necessarily subscribe to that mentality, but I've heard it said before. But you really have to make a choice, and you say, I want to do theater, and this is what I want to do, and I have to put all my energy into it. And your work ethic has to come along with that. Like when you're on a job site and you're given a task and you finish the task, instead of sitting around waiting for the head to tell you what to do, you go up to the department head and you say, hey, I finished my task. What can I do next? That little kind of shift in that shows that person supervising that day that you're motivated to do this. They'll give you another task, and they'll also remember you the next time they're looking for someone. They'll say, hey, that kid wants to work. You know, they may not be the most experienced, but that's okay. The way I look at it is that I don't need the most experienced electrician. I'll teach you what I need you to know. What I can't teach you is that work ethic.
Yeah, for sure.
I personally have three rules that I live by. Show up on time. If you don't know, ask. And if you make a mistake, admit it. those are three rules that I have lived by in my career and have served me well.
Yeah, for sure. Those, and I think those translate across like any industry that you're working in, too, for sure. But yeah, can't hurt.
Right?
Definitely,
And
definitely
really,
doesn't get
if you make a
time. And the
yeah, and
mistake thing too. Like, there's so many people that try to hide their mistakes, and it's usually quite obvious. So like, it's so
yeah,
much easier to fix stuff, especially in a theatrical setting, especially when you're worried about safety and stuff like that too. You just gotta like own up your mistakes, and you gotta fix it as soon as possible.
yeah, everybody's are human beings. I mean, mistakes are made, and you don't know everything in the world, so ask.
Awesome. So how do you see the industry changing, like both kind of COVID and just in general? We've talked a little bit about like some of the technology that's changing, the advance of like projections in theater, like color changing with lighting specifically. Um, but
You,
what's
you,
changing in your world, and where do you see it going?
you know what's really interesting to see, and it's been this change has been slowly happening for the last 20 years, but it's really accelerated very much so in the last 5 to 8 years is LED technology and what that's doing with the industry. Um, for a long time, LEDs weren't terribly popular in lighting fixtures because the intensity of the diodes was just not enough to be seen on stage. But as technology has advanced, we're really starting to see LED and color changing technology really ramp up, and the more complex control systems needed to manage those. But the LED technology is really what I believe to be a dynamic shift happening in the industry. It used to be one source for, you would put a gel in it, maybe a C changer, but really it was like one light, one color. But now, especially with the seven diode arrays, the amount of flexibility you can get from one lighting unit with enough intensity to actually be useful on stage is really opened up a plethora of opportunities for lighting designers. Because lighting designers, when you look at a lighting rig, pretty much a lighting rig is basically a toolbox, and you're filling your toolbox with your different tools that you need. You've got a front light system, you've got a backlight system, you've got a side light system. But if now you can have all these different systems that can do color changing easily by via the console, now instead of having to hang two or three different systems, you can just have one and it changes however you want. There's so much more flexibility that it gives their lighting designers. It's fantastic. Now it comes with more complex systems. Like, I never saw myself becoming a network engineer, but the amount that I've had to teach myself about computer networks and how computers communicate with each other and how different network devices communicate with each other, it's that has surprised me a little bit. But I'm now a network engineer half the time. Um, because data is like, there's so much more data. Like, AC power is still very important because it's all got to have power. But how does all the pieces of equipment talk to each other is so much more complex now because it's so much more that it can do. And the ETC, for example, has done a really good job of keeping up with it, and the control side keeping up with the unit side of the industry.
Nice. And then what about COVID specific changes in this industry, and like working in New York and seeing, Broadway's still on hold? What are you hearing? What are you seeing at the new school? Where do you think it's going?
Well, the industry as a whole is a little hard to say because it really is. I mean, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to change to a different camera. That camera seems to be having issues. There we go. That's better. Um, so the Broadway industry still feels to me like it's kind of everybody's on pause because everybody knows that at some point we're going to come back in person. Live theater is part of this is my own personal feelings on it, so I don't want to speak for anybody other than myself. But you're not going to really see theater. I don't feel like you're going to see theater go online or anything like that because there's still already a movie industry and a television industry that are already very good at recording things on camera and broadcasting them to large numbers of people, even via the internet. Um, like those industries are already there, so I don't feel like the theater and the live theater, the live event industry is going to ever overtake that. What you may see is a more blending of the two, because doing lighting for a camera and lighting for the human eye are really kind of different experiences. They use different tools. The human eye interprets light very differently from the camera. The way you manipulate the light is very different on stage versus for the camera lens. So I don't think you're really going to see a lot. Theaters are going to want to try to put their content out online more, but then you start getting into broadcasting rights and how do you make money off of that. And that's something that is kind of hard to do outside of a television and film setting, because again, those mechanisms already exist in television and in film and television. So we're still going to come back in person, and I feel like that is where everybody's still focused on. They're still focused on what do we do when we come back in person. I think you will see, and especially initially when we come back, things like social distancing of the audiences and social distancing of backstage settings are going to be much more strictly enforced. You're going to see a lot of capital improvement put into theaters, specifically HVAC and air circulation, because theaters are notoriously bad about air circulation and moving air around this giant cavernous space. So I think you're going to see a lot of companies and owners putting their money into upgrading those kind of systems. Um, and then you might see some places start to upgrade to more LED heavy rigs, because they can sometimes LED heavy rigs can be less labor intensive after the initial setup,
Mhm.
because we don't have to send somebody up in a genie lift every time you want to change the color or refocus the light. You can go to the console on a moving light and refocus, change the color. So I think you might see some integration of intelligent lighting a bit more. But again, we're still going to be in person, and theater is always going to be a labor intensive industry, just because a robot's never going to replace a guy standing on a ladder, hanging a light, and running a cable to it.
Yeah, for sure.
The educational setting, which is where I am in right now, that is I think you're going to see more online integration into that. I personally have not really done anything live. Most of what I'm doing now is teaching myself how to do broadcast engineering and filmmaking. I'm actually we're doing they're calling it a digital production of the Bacchae, which is a Greek tragedy. Um, I love how they put that term, digital production. It is a feature length film. We as theater professionals have taught ourselves how to use things like Adobe Premiere and video editing software, um, how to do things like Final Cut Pro for audio, uh, how to do asset management for recording, especially since we're not allowed to bring students to campus. They all have to record via Zoom. So how do you create something that looks usable but not have it look like a Zoom meeting? Um, it's, there's it, it there's some interesting challenges in there. A lot of it, so a lot of what I've been doing is teaching myself post production work. So like right now on the Bacchae, I have kind of fallen into the visual effects department. So I'm not doing like the editing to create the storyline, but I am doing what effects do we put on it to make it feel like you're in a different world. Color correction, because not everybody has the same lighting setup. So color correcting to make everybody feel like they're in the same world, even though they're not. How do we change the shape in editing so you don't feel like you're in a Zoom meeting, but you feel like you're in a dynamic situation where these people are interacting with each other, even though they have recorded a clip on a cell phone, loaded the clip into a Google Drive, and then we've kind of had to bring it all together. And how do you make the sound sync up? Because Zoom has built-in latency, and how do you compensate for the built-in latency in Zoom? So those are the kind of things that I have been doing the last 7 months.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to figure out right now.
I will say via Zoom, there's no real good way to do it. Even because what we've done is we've had each person film on their with using their cell phone,
Mhm.
because iPhones have pretty high quality cameras in them at this point. Um, so they do the recording and then we layer the videos. But even inside of that, there's still latency because each person is hearing their the other lines with different delays.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gotten real creative with, like, we don't put a bunch of boxes on the screen at the same time and then do a scene. It's often like one person at a time talking. So that way we can go in and real specifically cut out like 20 frames, put it right up. And by doing a cut, it feels like a natural thing versus if we just had a bunch of boxes
Mm-hmm.
and then did those cuts, it would look really strange because it would be like, you know,
Yeah, the first show we did like a meta War of the Worlds kind of updated thing where like it's a Zoom rehearsal, but it all starts kind of happening in the world of the actors as well. So that was kind of interesting to play with that idea that like we're just living in this Zoom world, but now we're working on a movie kind of remake that we're trying to update and running into some of those same issues and trying to figure out solutions right now. So that's very, very applicable. Um, so cool. Unless people have questions right now, we'll stop the recording and we'll invite everybody back and we can chat a little bit with Fletcher. But thanks so much for your time and for sharing your story. And it's good talking to you.
absolutely.